This is our cover of our book, Planting an Idea, Creative or Critical and Creative Thinking about Environmental Issues. I'm Natasha Kassulke, and I'm joined by Jerry Epps, my co-author. And we're going to just give a little introduction, how we sort of came to putting this book together, and then talk about some of the important themes that are addressed in the book. So, Jerry.
Yes, well, hello everyone, and I'm glad to be here this evening. The photo on the left, that's me at the ripe old age of about 12 with my 4-H calf, and that's me on the right, a little bit older than that. This is a bit of a rundown of my background. I worked as a county extension agent for several years in Green Lake and Brown County before becoming a professor of agriculture at UW-Madison. I did that, worked in Madison at the UW for 30 years. And in 1994, I left the university to write and do these sorts of things full time. In addition to the several books that I've written, I work with PBS Wisconsin, and I've done 6 documentaries with them. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen one or more of them. I am proud to say that one of them, even the one on Farm Winter, of all things, won a regional Emmy Award. My wife, Ruth, and I have 3 children. One of them is married to Natasha. So Natasha is my daughter-in-law. Ruth and I divide our time between Madison and Rochera, a farm that the family still owns in central Wisconsin. So on to you, Natasha.
Hey, thank you for that transparency, Jerry. Which is part of our message here tonight too, is being transparent and getting to know people a little bit, so you know where they're coming from when you have some of these difficult conversations. My name's Natasha Kassulke. I am a former journalist with the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison. I was there for 10 years. I went on to work for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Had a wonderful job as the Wisconsin Natural Resources magazine editor for some years. I enjoyed that a lot. It is our environmental publication. It is now quarterly. It is subscriber based. I did leave that position to take the position I currently have, the director of communications for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in the office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Education. And I love it. It really marries my interest and my education in science and research and English and journalism. And then in my free time, I teach part-time classes at Madison College, primarily journalism and in English. But most recently, I helped develop and am teaching for the first time a course in science communications. Interestingly, I have a couple students interested in journalism, but most of my students are interested in being scientists, and they want to learn how to better communicate. And as Jerry mentioned, I am married to his son, Steve, who is a photojournalist, and we live in Madison, Wisconsin. This is a picture of me when I was very young, maybe the last time I wore pink, but I grew up on a small farm in Jefferson County and was very active in 4-H, and then my more recent headshot. So, Jerry, why did we write this book?
Well, let's start on the left. We are concerned, as I am hoping most people are concerned these days, about environmental problems and air, water, land, people, plants, animals. And we also are very concerned about the polarization that seems to be taking place, where these problems and challenges for the environment have become political issues. And people have divided themselves as sort of a for and against doing something about them. And in this book, we're trying to make the point that these are everybody's problems. Some people want to say, well, let somebody else worry about that. I don't care. Well, we make the point in the book that this is really everybody's problem. And and not only are they a problem for this country, they're a problem for the entire globe. And if we think ahead, and as some of you watching, listening, have grandchildren, these are the kinds of issues that our future generations will face head on. And it will be rather a difficult time if we don't do something about them now. We are proposing in this book, not only proposing, but illustrating and showing with example why critical and creative thinking can help solve these problems. Unfortunately, some people find it more convenient to let someone else think for them rather than for thinking for themselves. And we come through, and I feel very strongly about this, that everybody has the right and the responsibility to do his own or her own thinking about these problems, and to do them not off the cuff without information, but to do the thinking with a sound background of research and analysis. Let's go on, Natasha.
So I think one of the things that makes this book really interesting for myself, and also I know it's being used in classrooms now, is it's structured as a guidebook. And so we believe that what we're presenting here, some of our thoughts on overcoming barriers, can be applied to various aspects of our lives, not just environmental, but we use environmental issues as an example of a process and how you might work through it. And we also think that solving some of these issues, it needs to be collaborative. And so we encourage our readers to sort of look within and challenge their own viewpoints, think about their biases, and then look outside themselves and be open to differences and diversity of voices. Being open to hearing from someone about how they came to have a certain opinion when maybe they grew up in a very different area or came from a different socioeconomic class or educational background. And then we want to not only present these ideas, but we want to inspire action. And so we're telling people, jump to it, take what they've learned, share it with others, share it widely, act on it, evaluate your success or failures, and then revise. And so it's this constant cycle of learning and improving. But it's a book meant to be used and a practical guide and to use in various aspects of your life.
Well, what are the most pressing environmental issues? We are concerned about several, and we talk about them, write about them in the book. But it can sometimes be overwhelming when you think, oh my gosh, all of these problems going on. Well, the ones we are looking at rather specifically in this book are those related to climate change. Climate change, interestingly enough, is on the minds of many people these days, as it ought to be. Another one is agriculture and pollution problems and food security. Sometimes we forget that our food comes from agriculture, and we need to be concerned about farms and farming and pollution and everything related to that. We're also concerned, talk about it in this book, write about it, forest and habitat loss. We're losing all kinds of habitat for wild animals and birds and all that sort of thing. We are concerned about water quality and the quantity and the pollution of water and how to take care of something that we take for granted these days. We must stop doing that. Water is and will continue to be one of the most pressing issues that faces our society and the world. and we don't have to look ahead very far as we examine and think about the droughts that have been taking place in the last year or two. We're concerned about air quality and air pollution and what contributes to it. There are many other things we could talk about, but for the purposes of this book, these are the ones we are using as examples that we can follow in this guidebook to do as Natasha says, to take action after we do some careful looking at some of the issues.
Right. And so we, I don't know if we fought each other over which issue we thought we really wanted to write about. But Jerry and I have had some really great conversations about these and going back and forth and talking about who might best work on which piece. But ultimately, I think we both kind of helped with all of it. So land use issues, endangered species is something of great concern. There's a National Geographic photographer my husband recently told me about who's trying to document endangered species before they're gone. My concern is also for the endangered species we never knew existed, right? Were gone before they were ever even discovered. Things like biodiversity and genetic biodiversity, depletion of our non-renewable resources. We highlight in this book having respect for First Nations and learning from Indigenous those who have come before us, who, Jerry has had a Three Sisters garden, and thinking ahead, an important lesson, that 7 generations. So thinking ahead 7 generations of what we're doing and how it might impact them. Population growth is a topic that's very uncomfortable for people to talk about, extraordinarily controversial, but we cannot sustain as many people as we have on this planet. Consumerism, so thinking a lot about decisions that are driven by things we want to buy, and public access is something that I think about a lot. I think about, I was, and I think Jerry too, we were both very lucky to have exposure to woodland areas and to outdoor spaces, but we have to also think about our growing urban population and how, children there can have access or go fishing and have some of the experiences that we were very lucky to have, having grown up in a more rural area.
What we are proposing in this book is, as we write here, a thorough examination of critical and creative thinking, which can provide a foundation that can be used in all matter of public discourse. What does that mean? Well, that means what we're talking about has application to environmental issues, but it has application to other issues as well, particularly those that are difficult for people to handle, difficult to deal with, rather easier to shove them aside. And we are talking about, again, both critical and creative thinking. And we're going to talk more about the difference and how to apply each of them.
So we're pretty clear here that we need to address the terminology and have make sure we're all on the same page. So that's another helpful lesson, right? When you're having difficult conversations, that you understand the terms. So we are defining facts as the truth. They're indisputable. In opinions, we are defining as judgments that may or may not be based on fact. We are encouraging people to look for objectivity, to try to analyze problems without allowing their personal bias, emotions, or assumptions influencing how they think. And how do we do that? Well, you have to know you have them first. You have to recognize you have these biases, or that you do have an emotional take on a particular issue, or you have made some assumptions over time. And once you know these and can recognize them, then you can start to evaluate them and the validity of those, and how they have brought you to believe what you do now, what opinions you have. And then we encourage people to look for those facts, to maybe start informing your opinions more on facts, and to maybe try to rethink some of our biases and the role that they are playing in how we formulate our opinions.
The people in this picture are my dad and mother, longtime farmers in Washoe County. Our farm that we have now is just a couple of miles from the home farm where I grew up. Here are the questions that are kind of difficult sometimes for people to answer. How do you know what you know? Well, who cares? Well, I'd be surprised. As we go forward with our ideas, people want to, I am one of them. I want to know, how do you know that? What evidence do you have? What experience have perhaps you've had? Why do you believe what you do? Oh man, that is a powerful question. That's the sort of thing I taught at the university for many years, helping my graduate students see how important it is in knowing the source of what you know and what you believe, and to look at your personal history, because most of us, our beliefs come from the time when we were little guys and gals, and those have stayed with us. And sometimes it's difficult to dig into this personal history and try and answer, why do we believe what we believe? And do we want to continue believing it? That's the important question, especially when it runs counter to the evidence that's available today. Let's go on, Natasha.
So in terms of critical thinking, and we can start with that and then move on to creative, but part of critical thinking is to identify a problem to be solved or a question to be answered. So when I am interviewing scientists, for example, I like to start with something like, what is your research question? What are you trying to answer? What is the problem that you're hoping to solve with your work? And then to gather information from reliable sources. And this is just, it's been a problem throughout history, but given the internet, the online platforms and social media, it's just really made it, I would say, dangerous. And it's so easy for people now to be posting misinformation, false information, and sometimes they're doing it intentionally. They're motivated to try to trick us into, and sometimes there's some kind of economic gain or a political reason. And so it's important that we are thinking about our sources and asking questions. Who is behind this information? What is their motivation for sharing it? Are they trying to educate? Are they trying to move us to an action? Looking at things like websites, and can you identify who is behind it? And learning to be, to analyze, because, as Jerry mentioned earlier, we're all owed the truth. I mean, and we can think for ourselves. But to do that, right, we need the facts, and we need to learn a little bit about these analytical skills that the librarians do so well for us. But then seeking diverse voices. And this is where, as a former journalist, I sometimes get a little down on media when I see they're constantly going back to the same sources, the ones that are safe for them or they've known for a long time. And I think it's important to talk to communities that are impacted by the issue. And I think it's important to talk to people of different generations and socioeconomic classes. I think something that's been really interesting in working on this book with Jerry is, he's written a lot of books. He's established a gifted author. This is my first book, and I learned a lot from him. And I hope he might have learned a little bit from me or got excited about some of the issues, because I bring something new to it. But we're also of different generations, and we grew up in different areas, and we have different educational backgrounds. That's all important, and that's part of what makes it more interesting and exciting. And when we start hearing other people's stories, so it isn't just always about data and numbers, but we need to get people in our stories. So I think seeking diverse voices is possibly the most important of those points.
What makes a reliable source is a question that's appropriate to ask. And here are several ways of going about checking whether the source of the information that you have found or have been told about is reliable. Personal experience, interestingly enough, I've written a good deal about gardening, and I've been doing it for 75 years. And that experience, when somebody argues with me, well, I can't keep the rabbits out of my garden. Well, I can tell them about my experience doing that, and whatever it's worth, I've done it. Peer reviewed. What does that mean? That means when you are looking at a piece of material, let's say a research report, did somebody else with competency in that area look at it and review it and make a judgment about it? That's an important fact, and that's something that those of us who've done university research, all of our research is peer reviewed. Another way of checking on a reliable source is, where does it appear? A trade book, a professional article, etc. If you can trace that back to who published it, what's the professional organization, is it reliable? Are they notable? Are they recognized as something that's been a group or an individual that's telling the truth? That's an important consideration. One of the big problems we have today is, how do we assess whether or not what we're picking off the internet, some online source, is reliable? And that's tricky. And so all of the things I've talked about so far are appropriate, most of them anyway, in looking at an online source to determine whether or not it's reliable. And then finally, examine the motivation for sharing. Some of the people, some of the organizations that are sharing information online are doing it for profit, not to inform people. Got to watch out for that. What's the motivation for sharing the information? Let's go on, Natasha.
And so another thing that makes this book, I think, really exciting and interesting, it's a guidebook, but we're also marrying the ideas of critical and creative thinking. So we think of creative thinking as new ideas, discovering something new, creating something new, and finding inspiration and enjoyment in sort of a nonlinear way. And then some writing tools that we have that I think Jerry and I both like to use, things like mind mapping, where you take a topic and then you think about how it relates to other topics and you start branching out. So you can take an issue like climate change, which is huge and it seems overwhelming, but then start thinking about, well, it leads to natural disasters. It creates economic impacts in the insurance industry. It affects certain communities who maybe don't contribute as much to climate change. So we have that inequality. And you start branching out from there and you realize it is a very big topic, but we can take it in these smaller, take these branches, and they become a little more digestible that way. Brainstorming is something that I think many of us used to do, and at some point in our lives, we just got busy and we forgot how to do it. But giving ourselves that time to think and to take in, I know Jerry likes to, he'll spend time up at the farm and, work there and think there. And it's a time away from the screens to get unplugged a little bit and allow your mind to kind of wander. And then free writing, which I enjoy doing and I share with my students. I like to challenge them to take something. Sometimes I'll just say, here's an apple. You start with an apple. For 10 minutes, you're going to write about an apple. See where it goes. Just keep typing. Because I think of writing like, our muscles, our writing muscles. We've got to exercise them just like we have to exercise our other muscles. And it's really fun to sort of see where it leads them. In 10 minutes, sometimes they come back to the apple, but sometimes it starts, they have great memories about their grandmother making apple pie or going apple picking. And so from free writing, they just end up with all these potential wonderful story ideas that Otherwise, I think a lot of people just they think they're not creative, and maybe they started out being creative as a child. We think of children and play and coloring and the joy you have playing as a child, and then we have to grow up and we got to get jobs, and then we lose a little bit of that creativity, or we think I'm just not a creative person. So these are a couple of tools we suggest for helping you get that feeling back.
But there are some barriers and to creative thinking. And I taught creative writing for 40 some years. And I emphasized that in creative writing, you need to tap into your creativity. And each of us has a creative self that's just waiting, I would argue, to be expressed. But we're told constantly, oh, be practical. I don't want your weird ideas that you're coming up with. Tell the truth. As we move forward in this society, we need some ideas that at the moment appear weird. And what happens is that we just don't want to be wrong. My gosh, you're wrong, Apps. I mean, I've heard that a lot. And sometimes it's true. But we move forward by trying something different, by looking at something in a way that no one has ever looked at it before. That's how we move forward. And we're bound up, thwarted in our effort by what I call discipline blinders. If you're an agronomist, you better think in a certain way. If you're
Right. Apologies for that. We had a technical difficulty, but we have Natasha and Jerry up here on our screen, and we will continue from where we left off.
well,
right.
we were talking about creative and critical thinking and the importance of using both of them in the solving of environmental problems. And of course, we also tried, I hope successfully, make the point that critical and creative thinking are the way for people in our society to deal with many of the problems that society faces these days. So what are the outcomes of combining critical and creative thinking? Well, they help us solve a problem. They seek a common goal. They identify obstacles to success, and there are multiple solutions often that result from combining critical and creative thinking in solving a problem. It can be, this combination of critical and creative thinking, a foundation for an opinion or for action. It provides an informed view, and it's something that's accurate and reliable, and it builds trust. You can't go off half-cocked in dealing with many of these issues because somebody's going to call you on it. And the extent to which you have evidence, the extent to which you have verification of what it is you have come up with is the extent to which you are building trust. The outcomes of combining critical and creative thinking are several. That activity can result in new learning, links between environmental and social justice, they value clear communication, seek and share diverse voices. All of that is embedded in doing critical and creative thinking, and probably more important than anything, it helps, doing this kind of thinking helps to debunk false information, disinformation. False information is meant to mislead you. Misinformation is something is wrong. Somebody misread something or didn't understand it and quoted it inappropriately. So those are some of the outcomes of critical and creative thinking that are, I think, very important. So who we are and what role must we play in the natural world? That's an important question, because too often I hear from people, oh, that problem is somebody else's problem. let somebody else worry about that. It is your problem. It's my problem. It's our problem. No matter if we're 20 years old or 90 years old, we are in all of this together. And the extent to which we are able to think for ourselves accurately and with the skills of verification and accuracy and all of the rest of it is the extent to which we're going to help solve some of these many problems. And in this book, we end up by talking about the importance of action, of doing something once you have thought about it. Because thinking, whether it's critical, whether it's creative, whether it's a combination of each, if it does not lead to action, well, why do we do it? We must agree that what we are, these are some action steps, which the visual says, take a deep breath and then the next step. Agree that what we are collectively doing is not working. It's okay to grieve our old opinions. Get on target for practical solutions. One size might not fit all. Silos have a place in farming, not in thinking. Silos meaning you think narrowly without thinking outside the box, which is another term that sometimes used. Find affordable solutions. Let's not forget, economics are involved in all this, and we are not so naive to suggest that these problems do not have economic dimensions, because they do. Consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. That's the Native American thought, and that's a powerful one. When you think, what am I doing today that's going to affect 7 generations down the road? Have fun when you're doing this, and as Natasha writes at the end, allow yourself to get dirty. Well, that's what gardening is all about. And we have a picture of planting seeds in a garden, because what we're trying to do with this book is plant some seeds for critical and creative thinking about environmental problems, and then collectively take action to solve them. So Natasha looks like she's coming back, and we're ready for some questions. Welcome back. We're ready for questions, Natasha.
All right.
Does anyone have a question or a comment or a rebuttal? We're open to it all.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Just to recap for those that did join us in person, Jerry and Natasha, would you just like to give maybe a very brief recap of the book? There was someone who joined us midway.
Sure.
Go ahead, Natasha.
Well, it's called Planting an Idea, and it's critical and creative thinking about environmental issues. And it is a guidebook. So we offer some thoughts on some of the most important environmental issues today, and address some barriers to why we're maybe not able to make progress in solving some of our environmental problems. And then talking about creative and critical thinking, and how together, using those, we have some suggestions for how to apply those to environmental issues and very difficult discussions in other parts of our life. And so it's sort of a call to action.
Thank you. And I do have a question. You talked about a little bit how you both talked about topics to incorporate in your book. Can you talk about the process of constructing your book with the topics, and how did you come about the idea of somebody critically thinking about these issues? And I know you touched it when you did the introduction and a little bit throughout the PowerPoint, but yeah, what steps did you take in constructing the book? Because I'm assuming you guys considered a lot. So how did you narrow that down with the topics you have on the book?
I can start by saying that for a very long time, and in fact, for all the 30 years that I was teaching at the university, one of the themes of my courses that I taught was helping people learn how to think, how to help people learn how to think for themselves, how to help them think critically as well as creatively. So that's something that I have taught at the university. I've taught in my writing workshops. And now Natasha needs to share with you how we debated what environmental issues we might use as examples.
Mhm. Sure. In my experiences, having been a journalist and environmental magazine editor, I was pretty interested. First, I started looking at, where do I come from and what issues matter to me? And then Jerry and I started talking about them and realizing that these are not particular to where we live, that these are global issues. And so I think we started thinking a little more narrow, thinking about the Midwest, but then we started looking and thinking more globally. So I think that was something that changed a little bit, but we wanted to think of, some of the really big, difficult topics. I think we were looking at some of the real sticky ones that are hard for people to talk about, that have become polarized in politics, and thinking about ways then that we might be able to get people to the table to find a common ground, to be able to start talking and thinking about what we can do about some of these. I also think, a big, very important part of this book, but I know in Jerry's writing career, has been telling stories. And so thinking about what stories we could share from our personal lives, so that the reader knows where we're coming from, right? As we talk about examining, how do you know what you know? What are your biases? That we each took a look at stories from our life that we thought might be impactful to share, that might be relatable or completely different for someone to hear. And so by doing that, hoping people would start thinking of their own stories, and we can maybe someday come to a conversation and a dialogue. So and of course, we were working on this through COVID. So we're thinking of a lot of the misinformation, health concerns, and climate change. We're certainly seeing just these horrific stories on the news practically nightly, of flooding and hurricanes, and just the devastation, wildfires. And so I think for some of these topics, they're in front of us every day. We're talking about food insecurity. Where is our food coming from? And seeing long lines at food pantries, for example, and the prices at grocery stores going up, and how transporting food impacts that. And so looking at our own stories, where we've come from, the things that were sort of troubling to us, and then thinking more globally about those.
Well, one of the things that I was particularly interested in is, as I've talked with people who, when we look at some of the environmental problems, and I mentioned some of this before, they're willing to leave somebody else do it. I don't want to get involved with that. I don't have time to do that. I'm too busy in my life. And we're trying to make the point, and I said this before, that each of us has the right and the responsibility to think for himself or herself about the problems that society faces. That's a tough point to wrap your mind around, because in this busy world, when people are working day and night just trying to put food on the table and a roof over their heads, this guy Epps and Kassulke, they're coming around telling us we ought to worry about the environment, for heaven's sakes. Let somebody else worry about that. Let the rich people worry about it. We can't do that. We've got to get over this politicization of it. It's not a political issue. It is a world issue that must be dealt with. And we try, I hope maybe not too subtly, to make that point that we all must do something about this, and we must do it in a way that is informed, that has evidence, etc.
I think one topic that really hit home recently that as I was talking to people, oh yeah, there's always wildfires in Canada. That doesn't affect my life until it did recently when we had air quality advisories, when it was dangerous for those who didn't even have serious health concerns to be outside in where we live, Wisconsin. And so suddenly it was because of the personal impacts and the warnings, affecting us here. Then people were like, oh my gosh, this is a global issue. These, the pollution travels in
Yeah,
the air.
it's too bad that we need to be hit over the head sometimes before we recognize that, oh yeah, that's a real issue. For example, we talked about water and water quality. And if you've got water, when you turn the faucet and water flows, yeah, that's not a problem. But it is. It's going to be in a lot of parts of the world, it's a terrible problem. People don't sometimes don't recognize that the earth has a supply of water that does not increase. It's there, and we've got to figure out how to keep it there. Oh, it's one of the complicated issues, and let somebody else worry about it. We all, I think, need to think about that too.
Awesome. Another question is that how do you see individuals taking this guidebook and implementing them in their day-to-day life? Because we know that there are priorities that take other people's time. How can one make time, or how would you want to see this book in a household or in a family so that they can take the ideas in here and implement them in some sort of way?
Natasha, talk about some of the applications that you've been working with while this book is being used.
I think, well, there's a story in the book that really Jerry illustrates. It's wonderful, talking about someone buying a new truck. And so you're buying a new vehicle. And whether you know it or not, right, you're researching the safety and what's this going to cost me? And but could you also think about its impacts on the environment, right? And your transportation in general. Then when you sit down with your family and you think of, well, could we carpool and take the kids to school on our way to work? Or we've seen some opportunities for remote work to cut down on the number of vehicles we have on our highways. So I think when we think about our daily lives, what we're doing, for example, I live in town. I do have a garden, but I have been an early adopter of planters for gardening, that if you don't have a lot of space, you want to know where your food comes from. You might just have a little porch or something that you could put a planter out there. And I've grown lettuce and tomatoes, and they've done wonderfully, sometimes better than in my garden, in planters. And then I think it's really important that we are, involving younger generations and, children, and having them participate and finding access for them. And so if there's a green space, can you get them to a park, a state park? Some of the schools have state forests.
Excuse me, Natasha, many schools now have gardens too. And
Yes, and community gardens. Yes.
garden is a wonderful way of introducing young people to nature, besides finding out where their food comes from.
So I think when we do that, but also, children they're creative and playful, and allow them to build some of these issues into art. When you have them create, a picture of a tree, or do a little research too. What kind of a tree is that? A native tree we would have here? What do you dry? I mean, you can start some pretty interesting lessons there. They're learning without even knowing that they are. And I think sharing our stories with young people and asking them what questions they have is really important. Kids have really fun, interesting, and can be very provocative questions. And so again, as we think about what we're leaving to future generations, I think we owe them that time. So I do think there's a great place for families to start having discussions. As a teacher, some of my colleagues are using it in the classroom now because it is a guidebook and it's heavily researched. Jerry and I have a long list of citations. We worked very hard to offer up some additional reading, and so you don't have to just stop with this book, but to read others, to again keep searching for the truth and facts, and trying new things to see what can work for you. And then things like getting organized with your local government, helping educate our politicians, I think is important. Jerry and I, we both write op-eds when we're talking about a subject, or I participate, my husband and I, in No Mow May, where we don't cut our lawn in May. And we are on board with our neighbors to help the pollinators that are emerging, little things like that that we can do at a critical time when we need pollinators for our food sources.
Yeah, the point, I guess, Natasha, is that every little bit counts. It doesn't have to be some magnificent thing that you're doing, but maybe it's growing a garden in your backyard that's 4 by 6 feet. Something as simple as that is a step forward. It's part of what we're trying to say in this book of planting an idea.
I'm going to take this moment to say that we are here with Jerry and Natasha. Right now, we are open for questions. If there are any questions from those joining us online or those in person. Okay, there's an additional question. You mentioned that we have our own biases and we need to think critically about how we move past those and look at the truth or facts. When someone is discussing the environment with a opposite view, do you have any strategies on how to guide that conversation so that there is the most benefit for the overall conversation in general?
One of the things to avoid is to let emotions rule the discussion. That happens too often. If you disagree with me, then you're a bad person, and I'm going to let you know it. That is not the way to go at these discussions. One way to go at this is tell me more about what you've just said. Tell me an experience that you've had that relates to that. Tell me where you got that information, rather than you're stupid and I don't want to have to deal with you anymore. We've got to get past that. We've got to get to the point where we're willing to listen to those who think differently than we do, who've come up with answers that are different from ours. Who knows? There may be times, oftentimes, when that person's idea, when that person's perspective is right on. It's better than anything I'd thought about. But to get there, sometimes you have to get past this. Oh, geez, that person's, I can't talk to them anymore. Got to get past that.
It's hard work. I mean, there are times I've changed my opinions based on listening to some I did not agree with, and in hearing how they came to believe what they do, made me realize that I was clouded by maybe some biases, whether it was something in my experience growing up, or love my parents if they told me something they believed in, right, and I was supposed to believe it too. But then, frankly, I have had to do the work, like almost a grieving process. Like, who am I? Who was that person, right? And I think that's okay because we're growing and evolving and learning, and that's exciting. And I'm certainly not the, same person I was when I was 16 or 21 or 30, and I'm going to stop there. But I keep learning and changing. And I think even things I learned writing this book. But I remember when I went to college, I was very emotional about topics. And it was hard for me sometimes to look beyond my emotions, where everybody must believe this. How can you not? Is not probably the best way to approach these difficult conversations. So I think Jerry's spot on when he says we have to learn to be better listeners. We can acknowledge our differences, but we need to do a better job listening and better understanding where we're coming from.
Keeping our emotions in check is so important. It is so easy to get to be angry when you should just shut up and listen.
Yeah. In the book, there are different environmental issues with us in Wisconsin. What do you think are the most pressing?
Well, Natasha, start with you. I'll share some of what I think.
Okay. Well, I do, so we think we're plentiful with water because we have the Great Lakes, right? But I think we talk about things like irrigation, things that affect the water on our farm. Jerry has never curse the rain. He's got a program on that. Sometimes we do curse the rain. Sometimes we get these massive flooding events. So I'm seeing, climate change effects on our water, having too much or too little. This summer, drought was, it's hard as I tried with gardens. It was not a good year for that. And that makes me very concerned. So I think water quality issues. And then I think Jerry and I both feel strongly about habitat and how it is used or lost. So Jerry, I'll let you talk about that. So mine would be, I'm very concerned about water quality and how climate impacts on that.
And as am I. Climate change it keeps popping up in my mind too, because there's evidence of it all over the place. The fires in Canada, the drought in the Southwest, excessive rainfall in the East. Those are all evidence, and tornadoes. Oh my gosh, how many tornadoes this summer? That's all evidence of climate change. So all of these things are a part of a bigger picture of our willingness to pay attention, keep reading, keep listening, sort out what makes sense. And as Natasha mentioned, and I've written about this in maybe more than one of my books, how we need to not be ashamed of grieving the loss of our old ideas. Because if we've held something for 50 years or 40 or whatever it is, and it's sacrosanct, it's very important, and all of a sudden the research evidence shows that is dead wrong. Well, that's a tough one for some of us to get past. And so it's okay to feel bad about that, to grieve the loss of where we were at one time. So we're not suggesting in any way that what we're advocating here is easy. It's not. It's just important. And sometimes those things that are important are difficult. And that doesn't mean we ignore them.
And it is, I think, Jerry and I said, this is everybody's job. This is too much for one person. We all have a role to play. Little, we can start small. And maybe, related to the question, what is the biggest environmental concern in facing Wisconsin? It might be, I guess, like empathy or not caring about it. We should all be caring and wanting to do something about it.
I think that's the major point we're trying to make in this book. When we say planting an idea, we're suggesting, hey, it's time for all of us to wake up and pay attention to the fact that something is going on that's not good, and we all have some responsibility for doing something about it. And we're trying to, with some guidelines, suggest how that might happen.